Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, because what you're about to see isn't fiction. These are real stories, hidden beneath ice and silence for decades. Somewhere in the frozen corners of the world, entire plains still sleep under the snow untouched, unchanged, and waiting to be found. Each discovery reminds us that time doesn't erase everything, it only hides it. This is Frozen in Time, where the mountains never forget. On the morning of October 13th, 1972, a Fairchild plane carrying 45 people lifted off from Mendoza, Argentina, bound for Santiago, Chile. On board were members of a Uruguayan rugby team, their friends, and family. The weather over the Andes was unpredictable, but no one imagined what was coming. As the aircraft climbed through the mountain passes, clouds thickened, and turbulence shook the cabin. Then, in a sudden white blur of snow and rock, the plane clipped a ridge, broke apart, and scattered across the frozen slopes. The world below never heard their final call. In the first hours after impact, those who survived were stunned, sitting amid twisted metal and silence. The fuselage, half buried in snow, became their only refuge against the wind. They had no idea where they were stranded at 12,000 feet, surrounded by endless white. When the radio crackled days later with the devastating words that the search had been called off, they understood that no one was coming. Hope faded, and cold became their only constant companion. The days turned to weeks. The survivors melted snow for water, using scraps of metal heated by the sun, and rationed tiny pieces of chocolate. They wrote letters to families they feared would never read them. At night, temperatures dropped below -30. Frostbite crept into their fingers, and the weight of the silence pressed on their minds. But still, they held on out of love, out of faith, out of something deeper than either. Then came another tragedy. An avalanche struck their fragile shelter, burying several alive. For those left, the will to survive hardened into something fierce and unbreakable. Food was gone, the air thinner by the day, yet the instinct to live remained. In December, after more than 2 months in the mountains, 2 men, Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa, decided to walk for help. Without maps, proper gear, or any real idea of where to go, they began an impossible journey. For 10 days, they climbed through snowfields and across peaks that stretched into the clouds. Their boots fell apart, their bodies weakened. But the thought of the others waiting in the fuselage pushed them forward. Finally, they saw a river, then a shepherd, then help. The world soon learned the truth. 16 had survived 72 days in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. When helicopters finally reached the wreckage, rescuers found the white fuselage still resting silently in the snow, surrounded by the footprints of those who had lived and the memory of those who had not. The discovery stunned the world, not only because survival had seemed impossible, but because of the moral choices that survival had required. The Andes had demanded everything from them, and yet, somehow, they had given it. Today, the wreck still lies in the mountains, half swallowed by ice. Visitors leave crosses and flowers near the site, where the wind hums endlessly through torn metal. It is a reminder that even when nature erases all traces of life, the will to live can defy it. The story of Flight 571 is not just one of tragedy. It is proof that even when time freezes, hope can still move. On the 2nd day of August, 1947, a British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian named Stardust prepared to depart Buenos Aires for Santiago, Chile. It was an ordinary post-war flight, 11 passengers, a 5-man crew, and a routine crossing of the Andes that hundreds of planes had made before. The pilot, Reginald Cook, was a decorated Royal Air Force veteran. His co-pilot, Norman Hilton Cook, was equally experienced. Among the passengers were diplomats, businessmen, and a young woman traveling to meet her fiancé. At 1:15 in the afternoon, the 4-engine aircraft took off into a sky that was bright and deceptively calm. No one aboard could have known that stardust was about to become one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. As the aircraft climbed westward, radio operators at Santiago received regular position reports, calm, professional, routine. Then, at 4:03 p.m., the final transmission arrived. It was brief, almost cryptic. ETA Santiago, 1745. Stendek. The word came through twice, clearly spoken, then silence. No one knew what it meant. The aircraft never arrived. Search teams scoured both sides of the Andes for days, then weeks. They found nothing, no wreckage, no smoke, no sign of an impact. The mountains gave up, no answers. The Chilean Air Force finally declared the flight lost, and the name Stardust faded into rumor. For decades, the word Stendek haunted investigators. What had the pilot meant? Some suggested it was a coded distress call. Others thought it was a misheard abbreviation, perhaps Stardust ending descent. Conspiracy theorists claimed it was related to Cold War espionage, that the aircraft had been carrying secret cargo and was deliberately hidden. But those were only stories, because for 51 years, no one knew where the Stardust had gone. Then, in 1998, a mountain climber on the slopes of Mount Tupungato, nearly 15,000 feet above sea level, spotted something glinting in the ice. It was a piece of metal, smooth, curved, and unmistakably man-made. When rescue teams reached the site, they uncovered the remains of an aircraft engine, fragments of a wing, and then, heartbreakingly, remnants of the passengers who had vanished half a century earlier. The discovery stunned the world. The mystery of Stardust had finally been unearthed, frozen in time, perfectly preserved beneath the glacier. The investigation revealed that the aircraft had likely flown directly into the mountain. In 1947, navigation instruments were primitive, and weather reports unreliable. The crew, believing they had cleared the Andes, began their descent too soon. The impact must have been instant, a whiteout collision that left no chance for distress signals. The glacier then swallowed the wreckage, hiding it for decades until the slow movement of ice finally released it. When searchers sifted through the debris, they found eerie relics of the past. A pocket watch stopped at 4:05, a telegram half-written in Spanish, fragments of jewelry, a diplomatic pouch, and scraps of paper with words still legible. Among them were letters that had never been sent, and one haunting artifact, the aircraft's star-shaped emblem, gleaming faintly in the sunlight, as if time itself had failed to dull its shine. The story of Stardust became more than an aviation accident. It became a story about patience, about the strange way the Earth keeps its secrets. For 51 years, the mountain had protected that small silver aircraft from decay, snow layer by snow layer, until the glacier finally exhaled it back into the world. The discovery also gave closure to families who had lived half their lives not knowing where their loved ones rested. And yet, one question remained. What was Stendek? Even after analysis of radio logs, phonetic alphabets, and Morse transmissions, no single answer satisfied everyone. Some say it was end desk, shorthand for starting descent. Others believe it was merely radio distortion, the result of poor signal in a storm. But for many, the mystery word became symbolic, a message frozen in the last second before silence, a code that only the mountains would ever understand. Standing on the glacier today, climbers still find pieces of the Stardust emerging from the ice, tiny rivets, glass, wiring objects that look as if they were made yesterday, though they have been entombed since the first years after World War II. The wind that blows across Mount Tupungato carries a strange hum, a low echo that seems to move between the peaks. Some say it sounds like an engine turning over once more. Others hear nothing. But everyone who stands there feels the same chill, the realization that time, even when frozen, never truly forgets. The story of Stardust is a reminder that disappearance does not always mean loss. Sometimes, It only means waiting for the world to look again, for the sun to melt the ice, for truth to return. In the frozen heart of the Andes, the mountain still holds the memory of that single word whispered into static: Stendek. It was the morning of January 24th, 1966, when Air India Flight 101 departed Bombay for London, with scheduled stops in Delhi, Beirut, and Geneva. The aircraft, a Boeing 707 named Kangchenjunga, carried 117 passengers and crew. On board were diplomats, scientists, students returning to Europe, and one of India's most respected leaders, Dr. Homi Jahangir Bhabha, the father of India's nuclear program. The weather across the Alps was poor that day. Heavy snow swirled over the peaks of Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in Western Europe, and clouds rolled in thick layers around its jagged summit. As the aircraft approached Geneva, air traffic controllers received routine transmissions from the cockpit: calm, professional, nothing unusual. Then, at 10:48 a.m., the radio went silent. Seconds later, residents in the French mountain villages below heard a deep, distant thud echo across the valley. For days, rescue teams battled blizzards and treacherous slopes to reach the area. When they finally arrived, they found fragments of silver fuselage scattered across the glacier at more than 15,000 feet. The impact had been instantaneous. The jet had struck the mountain face in near-zero visibility. There were no survivors. The French and Indian authorities conducted a joint investigation, concluding that a miscommunication between the pilots and air traffic control had caused the aircraft to descend too early. The coordinates were slightly off, just enough to bring the plane into the path of the mountain instead of the open sky. But Mont Blanc is a place that holds its secrets tightly. Over the years, snowfalls buried the wreckage deeper, layer upon layer, until the crash site disappeared from view. Families mourned, memorials were built, and the tragedy slowly faded from public memory. Then, almost half a century later, in the summer of 2012, a French climber scaling the glacier noticed something unusual. Protruding from the ice, a small metal box, perfectly preserved, engraved with the words, "Diplomatic Mail." Inside were documents marked Government of India, sealed envelopes, and letters frozen for 46 years. Not far from it, more debris began to emerge. Pieces of wing, landing gear, even clothing and newspapers, still legible beneath layers of frost. The discovery sent shockwaves through both France and India. Mont Blanc had finally released what it had taken. In the following weeks, local climbers found more relics: a camera lens, fragments of jewelry, an airline tag marked AI-101, and even the remnants of passports belonging to passengers long thought lost to history. Each item was a time capsule, a frozen message from 1966, preserved in the glacier's cold vault. One mountaineer described it as walking through a museum made by nature. The return of these artifacts reopened old questions. The official report had long closed the case, but new technology allowed experts to re-examine weather data, flight paths, and cockpit communication patterns. Their findings supported what many already suspected: a navigation misunderstanding compounded by extreme turbulence. Yet beyond the technical explanations, the story carried something deeper. The mountain had guarded these memories, protecting them from decay and time, as if refusing to let history forget. To this day, parts of Air India Flight 101 still rest on the glacier. Each summer, as the ice melts, new fragments emerge: a seat frame here, a shoe there, a faded airline emblem that still bears the color of its original paint. Locals call it the mountain that remembers. It's a phrase that captures something powerful: that no matter how high we fly, or how advanced our machines become, we remain guests of nature, and the mountains never forget those who challenge them. The wreck of Flight 101 is more than an accident site. It is a frozen archive of an era when aviation was pushing the limits of distance and altitude, when the dream of connecting continents carried both wonder and risk. And as climbers continued to stumble upon fragments of that Boeing 707, glimmering in the sun for the first time in decades, they are reminded that even the coldest ice eventually gives back its memories one piece at a time. In the early evening of March 12, 1948, Northwest Airlines Flight 4422 lifted off from Anchorage, Alaska, bound for New York City with a planned refueling stop in Minneapolis. The aircraft, a Douglas DC-4, was crewed by 6 and carried 24 passengers, most of them workers returning home from post-war Alaska oil projects. Unknown to many at the time, the aircraft's cargo hold contained something unusual: a shipment of gold ore bound for the United States Treasury. The takeoff was smooth, the weather mild for March. The 4 engines hummed steadily as the aircraft climbed into the night sky over the snow-capped Chugach Mountains. Then, just as the plane disappeared into the darkness, the radio went dead. At first, controllers assumed it was a minor communication error. Static interference was common in the Alaskan wilderness. But when no position report arrived and the aircraft failed to appear on its scheduled route, search teams were dispatched. For days, aircraft from the U.S. Air Force and Coast Guard flew over hundreds of square miles of mountains and glaciers. The terrain was merciless jagged peaks, blinding snow, and valleys so deep that radar signals vanished. There was no trace of Flight 4422, no debris, no beacon, no light. As the weeks passed, the search expanded but hope diminished. By summer, the mission was officially declared lost. The fate of the crew, passengers, and the missing gold became one of Alaska's greatest aviation mysteries. For more than 50 years, the Chugach Range kept its secret. Rumors grew, legends spread, stories of locals finding scattered debris, of strange metallic reflections seen during the midnight sun, of ghosts wandering the glaciers in flight uniforms. Treasure hunters whispered about the gold, believing the mountain held it like a dragon guarding its hoard. But no one could find proof. The glaciers moved slowly, burying whatever had fallen beneath hundreds of feet of shifting ice. Then, in the summer of 1999, a pair of amateur climbers exploring the Black Rapids Glacier made an astonishing discovery. Half buried in the ice were large fragments of aluminum, an engine cowling, and melted glass, unmistakable signs of an aircraft. When authorities arrived, they confirmed the impossible. They had found the long-lost Northwest Flight 4422, still entombed in the glacier, more than half a century after it vanished. The site was eerily pristine. The cold had preserved the wreckage so well that even paint markings were visible beneath the frost. Personal effects remained where they had fallen: wristwatches, fountain pens, fragments of logbooks, and a pair of glasses still folded neatly beside a seat frame. Investigators concluded that the DC-4 had likely flown into a hidden ridge during the night, instantly killing everyone on board. The impact triggered a fire, melting the surrounding snow before rapidly freezing again, encasing the aircraft in solid ice. Forensic teams recovered remains of the crew, later identified through DNA analysis, providing long-awaited closure to families who had spent decades without answers. But the story didn't end there. When recovery teams began excavating the cargo hold, they made a startling discovery: traces of heavy mineral residue embedded in the ice, consistent with the missing shipment of gold ore. Though the gold itself had long since dispersed or sunk deeper into the glacier, its chemical fingerprint confirmed the legends were true. Flight 4422 had indeed carried a hidden fortune. News of the discovery spread quickly, attracting journalists, historians, and fortune seekers alike. But for the scientists who studied the site, the most remarkable thing wasn't the treasure, it was the preservation. Inside the wreckage, fabrics, wood panels, and even printed maps looked untouched by time. The glacier had sealed the plane in a vacuum of cold, halting decay and preserving a perfect time capsule from the late 1940s. To stand there, surrounded by the remains of Flight 4422, was to stand between two centuries. The quiet was overwhelming, only the soft creak of ice shifting beneath the sun, and the whisper of wind moving through the broken fuselage. A few scattered artifacts were airlifted to Anchorage for study, but most of the wreckage remains where it fell, frozen in place, too fragile to disturb. Over time, the glacier will continue to move, slowly pulling the aircraft deeper into the valley below, where it will once again disappear beneath snow and silence. For Alaskans, the legend of Flight 4422 became more than a story of loss. It became a reflection of their land itself, vast, unforgiving, and full of secrets that only patience could reveal. The mountain had hidden its secret for 51 years, and when it finally chose to speak, it reminded the world that not all mysteries are meant to be solved quickly. Some take generations to emerge. Some wait until the ice itself is ready to let go. It was the night of November 22nd, 1952. From Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, a massive C-124 Globemaster II lifted into the dark Alaskan sky. The four-engine transport, one of the largest aircraft in the world at the time, carried 41 passengers and 11 crew members, soldiers, engineers, and airmen returning home for the holidays. The aircraft's destination was Great Falls, Montana, a long but familiar route across the rugged Chugach Mountains. The weather forecast was poor but not unusual for Alaska in November: freezing rain, gusting winds, and scattered clouds brushing the peaks. Inside the cockpit, the crew moved calmly through their checklists, unaware that within minutes their flight would vanish into legend. At 7 p.m., controllers received a position report, the last they would ever hear. Moments later, the Globemaster disappeared from radar. Witnesses in remote Alaskan villages recalled hearing a distant roar, followed by a single, muffled explosion somewhere beyond the peaks. Rescue aircraft were dispatched at first light, combing hundreds of square miles of terrain blanketed in snow. For 12 days, search teams battled storms, whiteouts, and avalanches, but they found nothing. No smoke, no debris, not even a signal from the emergency beacon. The mountain range was silent. By early December, the U.S. Air Force declared the aircraft lost with all 52 souls aboard. Families were left with only the word missing. For decades, Mount Gannet kept its secret. The glacier slowly advanced, swallowing rock, snow, and wreckage into its frozen mass. Each year, new layers of ice buried the past a little deeper. The C-124 was gone, or so it seemed. In the summer of 2012, a National Guard helicopter flying over the Colony Glacier spotted something metallic glinting in the sunlight. When they circled back, they saw the unmistakable shape of a wing protruding from the ice. A recovery team was sent to investigate. What they found stunned even the most seasoned search and rescue veterans. Spread across a field of ice were the remains of the missing Globemaster landing gear. Engines, twisted metal, and fragments of uniforms still visible beneath the frost. The wreckage was astonishingly well preserved. The cold had protected it like a vault, freezing the moment of impact in time. Documents could still be read, insignia still identified. Investigators determined that the aircraft had struck the face of Mount Gannet during a snowstorm and then slid into the glacier below, where ice sealed it for 60 years. When word reached the families, many of whom had spent a lifetime without closure, the reaction was a mixture of relief and sorrow. Children who had grown old now had a place to remember their fathers. The Air Force organized an operation to recover what they could, not only the remains, but the fragments of history entombed with them. Over the course of several summers, as the glacier receded, small teams returned again and again, collecting artifacts, identifying remains, and marking the site as sacred ground. To stand there was to feel the weight of time itself. The glacier stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface rippled with cracks and channels of blue ice. In the distance, the mountain loomed, silent and immovable, the same mountain that had taken 52 lives and kept them hidden for 6 decades. The only sounds were the wind and the faint groan of ice shifting beneath the sun. It was as if the earth itself had been holding its breath, waiting to release the story it had carried in silence for half a century. Today, the Colony Glacier continues to yield fragments each summer, a piece of metal here, a fragment of uniform there. Each one is carefully recovered, tagged, and brought home. The Air Force calls the mission Operation Colony Glacier, an ongoing effort to ensure that every trace of the fallen is eventually returned. The rest of the aircraft remains embedded deep in the ice, still moving slowly, inch by inch, toward the valley below. One day, perhaps decades from now, the glacier will give up the last of its secret. The C-124 crash is more than a story of loss. It's a reminder of how nature preserves what humanity forgets. The glacier did not destroy the plane. It protected it, keeping a promise that memory would one day be restored. 60 years after the Globemaster vanished, Alaska finally exhaled, and the frozen silence spoke its truth. It was the afternoon of June 30th, 1968, when a small Piper Cherokee took off from Locarno, Switzerland, on what was supposed to be a scenic flight across the Alps. On board were a local flight instructor, 2 students, and the hum of a single Lycoming engine that echoed softly against the jagged granite walls below. The air was calm that day, the kind of deceptive calm pilots of the Alps had learned to fear. Clouds hung low over the mountain passes, and the snowfields glittered faintly under a pale Sunday. The plan was simple: fly north over the Aletsch Glacier, cut across the Jungfrau Massif, and descend toward the Swiss plateau. The pilot knew the route well. He had flown it dozens of times before. But that day, the sky held something different, a quiet instability that only the mountains could sense. Around 3 o'clock, air traffic control in Zurich received a routine check-in from the aircraft. Then, within minutes, the signal vanished. The Piper never arrived. When controllers tried to reach the pilot, there was only static, the kind of endless, empty hiss that fills the headphones when nothing is left to say. The authorities launched a massive search operation, mobilizing the Swiss Air Rescue Guard, local alpine guides, and volunteers from mountain villages. For days, helicopters and climbers scoured the ridges and valleys, fighting wind, fog, and snowfall. But the Alps are masters of concealment. Avalanches can erase entire landscapes overnight. After a week of searching, the operation was called off. The mountain had taken another plane, and like so many before it, the Piper Cherokee and its 3 occupants were declared lost to the ice. For more than half a century, there was nothing. No trace, no clue, no rumor. The names of the crew were carved into memorials in the towns they left behind, but the wreck itself became one of the many mysteries buried in Switzerland's high glaciers. Generations passed. Aircraft technology advanced. Satellites began to map every contour of the Earth, and still, the Aletsch Glacier kept its secret. Then, in the summer of 2022, as the Swiss Alps experienced one of their warmest years on record, a mountain guide, leading a group along the glacier, spotted something metallic, half buried in the ice. He thought at first it was a hiking pole, maybe a piece of equipment from an old expedition. But as the ice melted under the afternoon sun, a small curved panel appeared, painted white and red. The letters barely visible but unmistakable: HBOYL, the tail number of the Piper Cherokee that had vanished 54 years earlier. News spread quickly through the alpine towns. Within days, investigators and rescue teams arrived at the site, using ropes and ice axes to excavate the area. What they found was extraordinary. Beneath just a few meters of compacted snow lay the remains of the aircraft, astonishingly well preserved by decades of cold. The fuselage was crumpled but intact, the cockpit still recognizable, and fragments of the engine gleamed like new beneath a thin glaze of frost. Even more haunting were the personal items scattered nearby: a pair of flight goggles, a wristwatch frozen at precisely 3:15, a small map marked in pencil with the route that was never completed. Scientists studying the site explained that the Piper had likely struck a hidden ridge during poor visibility, skidding into the glacier, where it was immediately buried by snow and rockfall. Over the following decades, the glacier's slow, relentless motion carried the wreck downward by several kilometers, preserving it as it moved, a time capsule drifting through ice. What had once been the top of the mountain was now the glacier's lower slope, hundreds of meters away from where the crash had occurred. The melting of the glacier, accelerated by a warming climate, finally exposed the wreck to the surface. Local residents traveled from nearby villages to pay their respects, some remembering the day the plane vanished when they were children. Many spoke quietly as they approached the site, reluctant to disturb the silence. To stand there was to see time itself revealed, aluminum and ice, the past and present meeting in the same thin mountain air. For the families of those who were lost, the discovery brought an unexpected peace. For 54 years, their story had been unfinished, suspended in the cold. Now it had an ending. The Aletsch Glacier, the largest in the Alps, has long been called the slow river of time. It moves a few inches each day, carving its way through rock and memory alike. In the case of the Piper Cherokee, it had not destroyed the plane. It had carried it gently through time, preserving it beneath layers of snow until the world above was ready to see it again. The recovery team decided to leave most of the wreckage where it was. Removing it would have been dangerous, and there was something sacred about the stillness of the site. The fragments of the aircraft glistened under the thin sunlight, a stark reminder of how fragile flight can be against the immensity of nature. Nearby, rescuers placed a small plaque with the names of the three who had vanished in 1968. It reads simply, "Here they rested for half a century until the mountain gave them back." For scientists, the discovery offered more than closure. It provided a rare glimpse into how glaciers move and preserve what they consume. For families, it was an ending long delayed. But for those who heard the story, it became something larger, a symbol of memory and endurance. The Aletsch Glacier is melting faster each year. As it recedes, it reveals what it has hidden for centuries: lost climbers, forgotten expeditions, and aircraft like the Piper Cherokee, frozen in time, waiting patiently beneath the ice. In that sense, the glacier is not a grave, but an archive, one written in layers of snow and silence. Every summer, as it exhales another fragment of the past, we are reminded that time does not erase everything. It only buries what it must, until the world is ready to remember. It began in the summer of 1942, a time when the world was burning, and the skies above the Atlantic had become a battlefield. The United States Army Air Forces were ferrying aircraft to Britain under a massive operation known as Bolero, a vital lifeline of machines, men, and hope, crossing one of the most dangerous air routes in the world. On July 15th, 8 aircraft departed from Presque Isle, Maine, 6 Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, and 2 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses. Their mission was not combat, it was endurance. To prove that America's newest fighters could make the journey across the Atlantic from Maine to Greenland to Iceland and finally to the war in Europe. The weather began to turn as the formation crossed the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Storm systems built without warning, clouds thickened, and the sunlight vanished behind walls of gray. Radio communication grew unstable. Navigation became guesswork. The B-17 seconds led the way, guiding the smaller P-38 seconds as the wind battered their wings. Ice began to form on propellers and windshields. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Pilots reported turbulence so violent it threw their heads against the canopy glass. By the time they reached Greenland, what had started as a training mission had turned into a fight for survival. As the formation approached the ice cap near Kangerlussuaq, they ran headlong into a massive blizzard, a wall of snow and wind so dense it seemed to erase the horizon. The B-17's lead navigator made the only decision he could: turn the squadron back. But it was already too late. With fuel running low and the storm worsening, They realized there was no way out. The sky, the sea, and the ice had become one. The only option left was to land somewhere, anywhere, before the engines gave out. At 13,000 feet above sea level, they broke through the lower clouds and saw nothing but endless white. There were no landmarks, no shadows, just a frozen wilderness stretching into eternity. The lead pilot called out through the radio, "This is it! We're putting down here!" One by one, the 8 aircraft descended through the storm. The first B-17 hit hard, its landing gear collapsing on impact. The second skidded to a stop, its tail snapping off against the ice. The P-38 seconds followed, their pilots bracing as metal met glacier. When the wind settled and the snow stopped falling, all 8 aircraft were down, battered, scattered, but intact. Against all odds, every single crew member had survived. For 9 days, they waited. The men built shelters out of parachutes and aircraft panels, rationing chocolate and canned rations as they endured temperatures that fell below -40. Their radio signals were faint, bouncing uselessly off the icy terrain. Days passed without rescue. They took turns standing watch, scanning the white horizon for any sign of movement. On the 8th day, one of the men saw a speck in the distance, a rescue plane circling overhead. The crew fired signal flares, waving frantically. Help had finally come. The rescue operation took another 2 days. One by one, the men were evacuated by sled and aircraft, leaving behind their machines those beautiful, frozen warbirds that had carried them through the storm. The P-38 seconds and B-17 seconds were left exactly where they had landed, abandoned on the ice with their cockpits sealed, their propellers half buried in snow. Within a year, when another team attempted to return for salvage, the aircraft were gone, not destroyed but missing. The glacier had already begun to claim them. As decades passed, the lost squadron became a legend. Stories spread among pilots and historians about the planes that vanished into Greenland's ice. Some said the aircraft had drifted out to sea. Others believed they had been crushed under avalanches. Few believed they still existed at all. But the Arctic preserves what it takes. Snowfall by snowfall, the glacier entombed the squadron deeper, pressing them into its heart. By the 1,980 seconds, estimates suggested the planes lay somewhere beneath 60 meters of ice, then 100, then nearly 300 feet below the surface. They were no longer just wrecks, they were relics. In 1981, a small group of aviation enthusiasts, calling themselves the Greenland Expedition Society, decided to find them. Among them was Pat Epps, a Georgia pilot and restorer, and Richard Taylor, an engineer with a fascination for Arctic history. For a decade, they planned, searched, and failed each expedition beaten back by the elements. But they refused to give up. "The ice took them," Epps said, "and the ice will give them back." In 1988, they finally found radar contact faint echoes of metal buried beneath more than 250 feet of solid ice. It wasn't a myth, after all. Beneath Greenland's endless white desert, the lost squadron was real. Now, the only question was, could it be reached? The following years became a battle between man and glacier. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal drills, they began the long process of digging. Each attempt was brutally slow. The ice refroze behind them. Machinery froze mid-operation. At one point, temperatures dropped so low that hydraulic lines shattered and drills seized solid. The expedition ran out of money, retreated, returned, and started again. Then, on August 1st, 1992, after nearly 50 years buried in silence, one of the aircraft was touched by human hands again. As steam melted the last barrier of ice, a dull green surface appeared, the wing of a P-38 Lightning, its paint perfectly preserved, its rivets gleaming under the glow of halogen lights. The glacier had kept it like a secret, frozen in perfect stillness, waiting for someone to remember. The men called it Glacier Girl. When they finally stepped inside the cockpit, they found everything intact. Flight controls, gauges, oxygen tanks, even the pilot's logbook sealed in frost. It was as if time itself had stopped mid-flight. Outside, the sun hovered low on the horizon, illuminating the ice tunnel like a cathedral. After half a century beneath Greenland's skin, one of the lost squadron had returned to the world of light. But this was only the beginning, because bringing Glacier Girl to the surface would take months of work, and what awaited above was a new kind of storm. The long, grueling resurrection of a plane that time itself had refused to forget. The moment the dull green wing emerged from the glacier, a hush fell over the team. They had spent years chasing ghosts, and now, at last, a fragment of history was looking back at them. But their work had only just begun. Beneath more than 79 meters of ice lay the rest of the aircraft, the fuselage, the engines, the control surfaces, and the heart of the warbird that hadn't seen the sun since 1942. Each inch of it had to be uncovered by hand. The team began carving a tunnel straight down through the glacier, a narrow, vertical shaft, no wider than a single person. The deeper they went, the more oppressive it became. The air turned heavy and cold. Lights flickered as generators struggled against the freezing wind. The sound of melting ice echoed off the walls, a slow, rhythmic drip that reminded everyone how fragile their surroundings were. They called the machine that made it possible the Super Gopher, a custom-built hot water drilling system that melted its way downward, inch by inch, creating a network of tunnels that reached the buried plane. The temperature inside the shaft was below -20. Every movement had to be deliberate. A single slip could mean disaster, a cave-in, an avalanche, or worse, a collapse that would seal the tunnel forever. And yet, every day, they descended. They cut through layers of ancient snow, each representing a year, a season, a memory. Ice that had fallen during World War II surrounded them, frozen echoes of the very storm that had brought the lost squadron down. When they finally reached the fuselage, the men stood in silence. The P-38 lay there, perfectly preserved, not as a wreck, but as though it had simply fallen asleep. Its propellers were bent but intact, the cockpit canopy unbroken, the olive paint faint but still visible beneath the frost. The glacier had sealed it like a time capsule. The moment they touched the metal, the sound echoed through the tunnel, a hollow, ancient tone that seemed to vibrate through history itself. Piece by piece, they began the painstaking process of cutting Glacier Girl free. The wings were detached first, then the tail, then the engines, each part hoisted carefully up the shaft through a system of pulleys and steel frames. Every lift took hours. The ice clung to the aircraft as if reluctant to let go. The work stretched into months. Windstorms shut down operations. Equipment froze solid. Yet each time they returned, the P-38 was still there, patient, waiting. When the final section of the fuselage broke the surface, the entire camp erupted in cheers. For the first time in half a century, Glacier Girl had seen daylight. Her aluminum skin reflected the Arctic sun like a mirror, a survivor reborn. The men posed beside her for photographs, their breath visible in the cold air. They had pulled a warbird out of the heart of the earth. But getting her home was another ordeal entirely. The team had to haul the sections across miles of rough, shifting ice to reach open water, then ship them across the Atlantic to the United States. By the time Glacier Girl arrived in Kentucky, she was battered and scarred, but still whole. There, in a quiet hangar in Middlesbrough, the restoration began. It took 10 years. 10 years of welding, polishing, engineering, and devotion. Every part was cataloged, cleaned, and restored with surgical precision. Technicians studied original Lockheed blueprints from the 1,940 to ensure every detail matched. Of the 2,000 rivets in her wings, nearly all were original. Even the bulletproof glass from her cockpit was refitted, still bearing faint scratches from the Arctic ice. Finally, on October 26, 2002, 60 years after she was lost, Glacier Girl took flight again. The roar of her twin Allison engines filled the Kentucky air, echoing across the hills the sound of a plane that had died and been reborn. Those who had worked on her stood silently, watching as she lifted gracefully into the sky, her silver wings gleaming. For a few brief moments, it was as if the past had returned, as if the war, the ice, and the years between had all melted away. Today, Glacier Girl is more than an aircraft. She's a symbol of endurance, of obsession, of the quiet persistence of those who refuse to let history fade. Every scratch on her frame tells a story of the men who flew her, of those who found her, and of the decades she slept beneath the glacier. The lost squadron still lies under the Greenland ice, their coordinates partly known, partly myth. But Glacier Girl escaped. She flew again, proof that even when time buries something deep enough to forget, the will to recover it can bring it back into the light. As her engines thundered through the sky once more, you could almost imagine the others still waiting below, frozen in silence, watching her fly, the first to escape the ice, the last survivor of a world locked in snow.